But today we have a really, really important topic, and no pressure to our guests, but what we're here to discuss today is how creativity can be used to accelerate progress. So we've talked about what progress is. We've talked about the need for progress. We've talked about acceleration. We've talked about business, but we haven't identified creativity as the tool to do it.
So we're really thrilled to bring in Melissa, who is an inspiring human and thought leader from the American Composers Orchestra. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation as I just recently met her. I believe she's a genius, just like all of us. And I'm really looking forward to learning and gaining any insights from her today.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be with you both.
So let's start with an introduction. Let's set the stage for who is Melissa and how did she become so good at playing the flute?
I became really good at playing the flute by misbehaving and ignoring all of the advice that was given to me. I mean, honestly, when I picked it up, it was just because I wanted to be like one of my friends who played the flute. And my band teacher was like, listen, you can't even make a sound on this thing. You should play the oboe. You should play the clarinet. You should just do anything else. And I was like, I'm going to play the flute. And it took me 3 months to get a single sound out of that thing, but hard work. It was this, I always say this, like the most important things I've ever done in my life, I did while misbehaving in some kind of way.
Love it. What is the quote that we've been hearing lately? Let's make good trouble.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that what it is? Right?
Oh, yeah.
So why flute? Just curious.
For me, I think I was into the challenge. I had friends who played the instrument. I also really loved the sound of it being an instrument that's very much at the front melodically of a lot of ensembles. And it's also kind of a mysterious thing, right? Like when you play a clarinet or an oboe, you have something that goes in your mouth and you blow into it. But the flute is sort of this ephemeral thing where you're blowing across the instrument and you have to shape yourself in exactly the right way, sort of like blowing across a Coke bottle, if you've ever done that. It's not obvious how to make a great sound. It takes a lot of effort. But once you get there, it's kind of a physical, spiritual practice of actually making all of that go. So I've gotten to the point as a teacher where I can close my eyes and be across the room and know physically what someone is doing inside of their head to make a sound good or not good, just from years of practice.
With my background, I know piano, I know guitar, I know a lot of like keys and instruments like that, but I never practiced woodwind. And it's really interesting hearing that, it's a completely different instrument and it kind of like it evokes this magic. And that's what I noticed from you. I was like, Melissa seems like a very magical person. And I'm really interested in how you got into this career, like how you got into the American Composers Orchestra.
Yeah, well, first of all, I love that you use the word magic. That's not an accident in my life, actually. So we can come back to that in a moment. But, my path towards ACO was a little bit of, as I said, kind of happy accidents along the way. As Simon mentioned, I started as a professional flutist, but I came to it in kind of a strange way. I was always very curious about many, many different things in the world. And as a matter of fact, my dad was sort of like, Melissa, you're valedictorian of your class in high school, go into hard science or international finance. You're going to eat pasta out of a box in a leaky basement for the rest of your life. If you go play the flute, what's wrong with you? And I just had this sense, and Callan, to your point about magic, I had all the Ivy League applications filled out. But I remember there was a day that I was at the Eastman School of Music for my audition, and I walked into the main call and I just said, this is where I'm supposed to be. I don't have any rational reason for understanding that this was the school and this was the place. And they had the gall to waitlist me. And I called them a week later and I said, listen, I know you're taking 4 flutists this year. I know 3 of them and I know 2 of them aren't coming. So you're my first choice. You should accept me. And they did. It's a little bit of determination, but I will say that I was at the right place at the right time, because at Eastman, they were very intentionally having the conversation around arts leadership. It was probably 5 years into the arts leadership program, which was a new program that they had put in place to not just teach you how to play an instrument, but how to lead in the field of arts and culture. And at the time, if I were to evaluate it through the lens of what I know now, I would probably say it was leadership of existing institutions at that moment. Things have evolved, and I'm proud to say I'm on faculty there now. But the thing that was really special is that they were really starting to have the conversation around why is music making, why is culture work, why is that important out there in the world at a time when the usual refrain was classical music is dying. Like that's all you would hear. And so I was involved in all these conversations that were about building a new skill set for artistic practice, for creating work in the world, but also really understanding the why. And, for me, the pivotal moment, and anyone who knows me knows I tell this story all the time. After I graduated from Eastman, I got called to play in the Civic Orchestra of Chicago. So I moved to Chicago right after my undergrad. And I was part of a program called MusiCorps at the time. Now it's the Civic Fellows Program. And in that program, we went out into community spaces. We were teaching youth orchestras. We were doing a whole bunch of different things. But I remember a very specific concert where I was playing for the first time a concert that was in public that I had programmed myself. It was chamber music. It was like in a public place, like a park or something like that. And I realized it was the very first time that I was playing music for people who weren't my peers, my adjudicators, someone to give me a grade, someone to help me win a competition, someone to give me a job, right? And so it made me really think, like, what is my purpose for being here? What is it that I'm actually doing here? If it's not to advance myself, which if you think about it, a lot of musical training is purely about your own advancement. And to be able to be in a place to shift that purpose, I had this gentleman come up to me and he was like, yo, you guys give good game face. And I was like, oh, what does that mean? And
what does that mean?
Exactly. So I did actually ask him. And it turns out he's a Chicago firefighter. He was at his very first classical music event. And what he was noticing was the eye contact and body language that the chamber musicians were using with one another, which in his world is life and death. They've got all this equipment on. They're doing this and figuring out where to go. They're not talking to each other. But he's like, that's exactly what we do all day. And it just made me think, I'm out here, hands open, giving a gift. The things that I focus on in my training and my technique, they help me get to a certain level of facility, but that is not the point. The point is what people will take away. And they might not say to you, hey, your B flat was a little out of tune and therefore I hate this show. But they're going to take something from this experience and relate it and apply it to their own life in a way that's going to be helpful. So I ended up actually focusing my career on the pursuit of that. So I started an organization and ran it for 15 years. And we can talk about that a little bit more. And then at the right moment in time, ACO came to existence in my own life. Like there was an opportunity to lead the organization. And what I loved about it is an incessant focus on creativity and nurturing of creatives and creative practice.
I'm so sorry. I want to pause you because I definitely want to do that. There's a big chunk there to get to ACO.
Yes.
But before we get to ACO and the formation of your own organization, that was Fifth House, right? That was the formation.
Exactly.
What I want to talk about is, there's another thread happening when we talk about the magic or the different perception of what's happening, the actual execution of the music versus the purpose of the music. And I think that's a really important underlying theme that we've talked about. You are a classically trained flautist. Do we say flutist or flautist?
I'll respond to either, both, or hey you, but I say a flautist is a flutist with their nose in the air, so it's fine.
Well, I think a classically trained fluter, and what you did with all your fluting is, intentionally fluting, is you learned how to masterfully execute something that was provided to you. But you always saw that there was something beyond just executing a set of instructions, right? And that's something that I think has driven you underneath, and not to put words in your mouth, but something that drove you to say, I need to do more than execute a set of instructions. I need to create the instructions. So I'd love for you to talk to us about the formation of your first organization.
Yeah, of course. So for me, forming Fifth House was something that I did because I had this real desire to understand how music could be helpful in the world beyond playing for people or teaching people to play an instrument. So exactly as you said, Simon, I saw what it was meaning to people to have the experience of making music, not just for people, but with people. And I can't say that we knew everything about how that was going to go down when we formed. At the beginning, it was just a curiosity and a question. And I will also say I formed with some of my greatest and most favorite friends and colleagues. Many of us were also alums of the Civic Orchestra of Chicago. So I really have to thank that organization for putting us in contact with the public in the ways that we were, because oftentimes as a musician, you're sort of taught that your job is to go backstage, come on stage when the lights come up, bow, and then go hide again. You know what I mean? And there's so much in the world about citizenship and musicianship being closely intertwined. That's always the way it has been. The fact that we have to have this conversation just shows up how off center we have come as a society, that we don't remember that. Like, in a way, everything I'm about to say to you is not new. It's actually ancient and old, and we just have to remember. But in terms of creating Fifth House, we just followed a 15-year path of boundless curiosity. It was starting with everything from how to tell stories through music by collaborating with, actors, dancers, graphic novelists, video game designers, and eventually communities of people. So instead of telling a story that we devised or that artists devised, it was stories that were gathered from the public. We were also engaging with various ways for the public to interact with and create along with us, whether it's in the moment or in the lead up into an experience or a show. And by the end, we had 15 years of experience in arts integrated programs in public schools. So teaching core curricular subjects and music at the same time and helping understand the curricular connections and the process between those. But I think the work that I'm even the most proud of is 6 years of research with Loyola University's Center for Urban Research and Learning inside of multiple residencies that were multiple years long in organizations that were serving people transitioning from homelessness, incarceration, or into stable employment. And in all of those circumstances, it was figuring out how a creative practice could be transformative towards potential on a wide variety of levels, whether it's professional advancement, personal transformation, or academic growth.
I love that. What's a story from that? What's a moment that you remember, or something that really felt like creativity was solving something?
So what I can say is that I'm a hyper goal-oriented person, like almost pathologically so. And I'm happy to talk to you about how I discovered the practices that we ended up using. But in terms of a moment that was within one of those residency programs, I'll give you two. One of them was at Deborah's Place. We were working with a group of women, 55 and better, who were transitioning from being unhoused into stable housing and employment. And we had been doing for a couple of years, creativity-based work that was largely on creative writing because they wanted and had a strong interest in poetry. But we started using a practice called deep listening, which is a practice that Paulina Oliveros, who's a wonderful composer, put out there in the world. And it has aspects within it of listening and sounding, movement, and dreaming, because she really believed that listening is an act of consciousness. It's not a physiological act like hearing. You're actually choosing and engaging with intentionally through your attention various things that you are hearing around you. So there was a moment when we performed one of her pieces on one of her visits, which is called Teach Yourself to Fly. And it's a piece where you just sit silently, observe your breath, gradually allowing your breath to become audible. You transition that into your voice. And then if you feel called to do so, you may transition it into an instrument. And we had researchers from Loyola with us. We had women from Deborah's Place with us. We had musicians from Fifth House. We had a social worker with us. And there are toy instruments all over the ground. And we start playing this piece. And when I tell you I left my body for 45 minutes, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, it was everything from song to boomwhackers to like toy keyboard instruments and just this endless psychedelic jam where we all just sort of levitated together. And, when we talk about what we train for as musicians, we train for playing Tchaik 4 in a big hall and doing it really, really well and getting a great job. We don't necessarily train for what it means when you put people in a room and encourage them to make something from the deepest creative impulse within them, and what it means to have the vulnerability to put something out there that you're like, this is weird. I've never done this before. I don't know these people very well, and have somebody else respond to that, say it back to you, validate it, and have that shape what we're all doing as a group without any conversation. That's an experience that a lot of people don't get to have. So for me, it really shaped why this is so important and why, a person like Pauline, who is an experimental music composer, her work having served as an invitation for so many people to find that within themselves, I mean, I think that's magic.
So many amazing themes emerging here. And one of the things that I want to make sure is clear, because I suspect that there are some folks listening who might be a little confused about something you recently shared, which is the combination of music, performance, but also research, science, social progress, supporting people, equity, justice, communication, etc. What I would love for you to be able to help us connect is, when a lot of folks think about music, like you said, they think about, I'm going to go listen to a concert, have some fun, and then go live my life. But what you're doing here is you're connecting music to make progress, right? And sorry, I'm not being very eloquent here, but you're using music to drive progress. And can you help us connect those dots, right? Help us make it really obvious. How are you using music and the power of simply picking up an instrument to communicate and helping to spark a change within a group of people, a society, etc.?
Yeah, of course. So I told you that I would give you 2 examples. And so the second example is a great one out of what you're saying just now. So I'd mentioned earlier that we had done the last 6 years of work in relationship to Loyola University and their Center for Urban Research and Learning. And this is a group of researchers that is active in multiple different areas, but not the arts usually. And I appreciated that about them, because what we're really looking for is, Simon, exactly what you said. What happens when people are invited to be creative? And how do we measure that in ways that sit outside of the arts, but are accomplished through an artistic practice? The reason we came into relationship, we happened to meet each other socially at some kind of event somewhere. But the reason we started working together is that I was having a conversation with the principal of the special school, which is inside the Chicago Juvenile Detention Center. And we were looking to start a residency there. We had a lot of information about what we had done previously in other schools and what kinds of results we had seen. But she just said, listen, we're so busy. I just need a half a sheet of data that just shows me why your program works and why it's worth us spending our time this way. So then we came back to Loyola and said, I need that half page. I need to be able to transition the things that I know in my heart and that we have seen and can communicate through story into hard data. So for me, what I think was really special about their process and what I learned the most is that, first of all, when arts organizations are measuring impact of the work that they're doing, if they do it at all, because sometimes it can be spotty, a lot of times what they're doing is they're measuring things like attendance or re-engagement. They're also measuring skills-based outcomes, like how well do I play my instrument today versus tomorrow, that type of thing. But as you could probably guess, we were interested in very different metrics than that. And the thing that I most learned was that they actually observed for a full year before saying anything at all about what we were measuring or what we were doing. And that was a very different way of approaching it than I'd ever imagined. They were in the room with us every visit of 6 long-term residencies. And when I talk about the scope, I mean, the last year we were at the Juvenile Detention Center, we were there 120 days a year. So this is not a small commitment. And so they were taking notes. They were looking for patterns. They were tracking insights. And at the end of that first year, what they said to us was, this is kind of a weird surprise. But you're actually, despite the fact that you're working with very different populations, you have very different goals for each of them, because the goals are articulated by the participants and by the institutions we're working with. You have different methodology. You have, in some cases, different people, different schedules, different lesson plans. The weird thing is it's the same everywhere you go. The impacts that you're having, they're exactly the same. So it starts with mindfulness first, the ability to be present in the moment. Then we have agency and empowerment. So agency is, I have an idea of my own that is distinct from all of your ideas. Empowerment is, I feel comfortable sharing it with you. And then there is collective decision making. So often we're asking people to make creative work together. And then here's where things get very interesting for this conversation. Creativity was the last marker. That was the ending point. And when they talk about creativity, they encourage us to say, through this lens, creativity is not just about making a work of art, although you are, of course, inviting people to do that, and it's very satisfying. Creativity in this context is about imagining a set of circumstances that does not yet exist and making it real. So if you think about the suite of those activities, being able to be present, having your own valued thoughts and opinions and having the courage to share that, building things together with other people, and singing something that doesn't exist into being, that is a powerful skill set or suite of things for transformation. And by the way, to answer the question which might be on your mind, why was it the same everywhere if what we were doing is different? The thing that was special was not what we were doing, but how we were showing up. The mindsets and behaviors of the teaching artist was 100% the reason why these things were happening. It was flexibility. It was role adaptability. So being able to show up as a performer, a facilitator of conversation, a instructor, a co-participant in an activity, like flexibly moving between those roles, meeting people where they are. So recognizing that it was okay, however they showed up in the room, even if they didn't want to participate, like observation is participation was a phrase we would use all the time. And that was often the space of comfort through which people would participate, even by the end of that day. So showing up in those ways were what was producing those results. And even though, we're extremely tactical about how we design things and how we're moving people towards the types of markers that we're hoping they will move towards, there's always an openness in seeing what comes. So I would say my second example of, moments that I found utility in creative work, we were working in a organization called CARA Chicago, which has an incredible data-driven approach to advancing people into stable employment and a 12-week curriculum that is time-tested and highly effective. And we knew that if we brought this work in, they think about hard skills and harder skills, for lack of a better word, which I kind of love that methodology. And we were there to sort of impact those. So we knew that we would get people there quicker. What we didn't know was that the activities we would bring into the room would be some of the best early diagnostics for anyone who is fresh to the group. The way people participate with one another, the way they feel comfortable doing vulnerable and creative things, you can see in their degree of comfort with those activities where they most need support between our visits. And that was similarly advancing people in between the times when they were being creative. So maybe I'll pause there, but just to say, there was real data behind why this stuff works. It wasn't just a bunch of like crystals and sandals. You know what I mean?
Well, we have to, before we transition to talking about ACO and what you're doing now and what we're talking about, two absolutely critical things I just want to make sure we've extracted from what you just shared, in my opinion. One, which is just the definition that creativity is the ability to see something that does not yet exist and figure out how to make it real, right? Creativity is seeing something that does not yet exist and figuring out how to make it real. We don't talk about the tools. We don't talk about playing music. We don't talk about drawing pictures. We don't talk about any of that. It's just the ability to envision something that doesn't yet exist. And the second piece is using the tools that you've got to accelerate people towards the ability to do that, right? If I understood correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you talked about folks who are transitioning out of, formerly incarcerated citizens, maybe homelessness, transitioning from really, really difficult situations where, as to quote you, they've got hard skills and harder skills they need to learn. But the tools you bring to the table, music, art, creativity, can vastly accelerate their ability to get those skills or diagnose whether or not they'll be able to do X, Y, or Z. Is that an accurate summation?
Absolutely.
I'd love to add to what I also heard alongside of music, art, and creativity are the humans behind it, the leaders that are trained in that practice to be able to be flexible and to be able to be understanding, because that's where true empathy lies, is like that container to be able to allow for change and allow for creative moments to happen. And that's something that I really believe in. And I love what we're doing here at A Little Better Co, because we're bringing the people around, the leaders that believe similar things and believe in that flexibility. So I feel like that's also another big, huge part of that.
Yes. And, just to affirm one of the things that you said earlier about how your own practice as a group of understanding creativity, how it can be used, has changed the way you think about yourselves and one another. The last 2 years of that study, they flipped the lens around and they weren't just looking at the participants, they were looking at us. And what they saw was that it didn't matter how you came into the room, whether you saw yourself as a participant, as a researcher, as a musician, as a teaching artist, you were seeing the same impacts, the same positive growth in all of those areas. So it's worth knowing that participation in those, even if you happen to be like the trained one, there's no such thing really. Like you're actually coming in and benefiting in all the same ways. So every time I get to do deep listening work now and people are like, oh, that's so great you're doing that for us. I was like, no, this is a gift for me. Like, I'm really glad to be able to do this with you.
Yeah. Well, and if I can also extract another quote, and again, Kellen, you're always the more human one of us, but just the fact that you proactively said it's not all sandals and crystals, that's part of what we're trying to communicate. And on our last episode, right, we spent the entire time talking about how you measure, test, and prove the efficacy of this type of work. But there is this misconception, right, that this is music, it's art, it's sandals, it's crystals. I'm going to use that forever now. I love that.
Feel free.
And it's not, right? These are incredibly powerful tools to drive progress in a lot of different ways. So pivoting back to your own story, let's make the transition to ACO. How do you end up at ACO? And let's really spend the rest of our time together talking about the world that we're trying to build and the role of ACO and creativity and helping to build that world. No big deal. Small little.
Absolutely. And, I want to come back to what you just said a second ago before I go into that. Because it's going to tie back to something that Callan said earlier, this idea of magic. We think of magic as being something that's like, oh, you got to like have a bunch of crystals and like a big cauldron and like robes or whatever. And
which we all have, right?
Which we all totally have. But I think the thing that is really helpful, and I heard somebody say this to me once, there are a lot of ways to get there. People get to consciousness-based work through a lot of different practices. They might call it magic. They might call it mindfulness or meditation. They might call it spiritual practice. They might call it art making. There's so many different windows into this. But, I heard somebody say once, when you think about who's a great magician, you're going to think about that person who's like wearing robes or like saying spells. Who that really is that person who's sitting at their desk in like middle management somewhere and things just happen to come to them easily. They just are really good at their job. They're a good person. They connect well with people. The things that they want to see happen in the world manifest. And it's not for reasons that anyone can really put their finger on.
So just to be clear, we don't have to wear our robe and our wizard hat for really great things to happen. I just want to be clear. I love that. I love that transition. All right, let's talk about ACO. And I'm sorry to keep driving you to push into ACO, but there is a very specific reason why, right? The formalization, the infrastructure, and sort of the accelerator model. So tell us, if it's okay, if you're comfortable sharing, how did you make the jump into ACO? What was it like when you got there, and in a way that won't get you in trouble, right? What are you trying to build?
Yeah, of course. So, I was at a point in my life where I knew that I had done so much of what I wanted to accomplish on my instrument as a performer, and I was starting to be pulled in a lot of different directions. I mean, based on the work that Fifth House had been doing, we'd been asked to do more sort of consulting work, design work. I'd been working with orchestras, opera companies, higher education, and really reimagining emerging artist training, and also thinking about organizations as they're taking their first steps in civic imagination work, like building work with the public. So for me, it was a really interesting moment to step into an organization where I saw the potential for systematic growth of creative-based work. Yes, within the orchestral field, but to me, what's always been most important, orchestras shouldn't survive for the sake of surviving. They're there because they are gathering places at scale for people to experience and participate in creative acts, which I believe are transformative. So from my view, I think that what I saw in ACO was an organization that when I arrived had been around for about 45 years and was founded with the mission of helping American orchestras be more American. To really get at the point that, American orchestras were...
We're going to unpack that one in a second.
Yes. That a lot of the music that American orchestras were playing was not American at all. And, that the institutions were formed on their European counterparts. And, around what had happened with American orchestras is this rich and vibrant culture of American music, which, arguably in some cases is our greatest export. So to be in a space where we're really thinking about how to bring all of that richness of tradition onto orchestral stages that's been a really important piece of ACO's history, both in terms of who gets to make music, but also the richness of style and genre diversity that exists out there. So one of the things that was really cool about ACO is that, yes, it was founded as an organization that plays new music at Carnegie Hall, and that's the way it had talked about itself for a long time. But what I saw was actually that for over 25 years of that 45-year history, there had been a program called Earshot, which connects ACO with orchestras all over the country and in some cases all over the continent and the world, and really is a discovery space for composers who are making beautiful creative art and connecting those composers to orchestras for readings, for residencies, for commissions, and other opportunities. And the story that hadn't really been told is that, it had been so good at that job that if you look at the top 3 composers who are alive and being performed by American orchestras today in terms of frequency of performance, they're all alums of ACO's program. And also at a moment where orchestras were thinking very deeply about what representation means on their stages. ACO was accomplishing a recruitment model that brought between 75 to 85% of the composers who are in the program are composers of color. We have around, at least last year, 65% are women, to be in a space where we're really advancing people who historically have not had access to that opportunity. And, when I talk about that work, yes, there's an aspect of it that is righting a past wrong. But ultimately, for me, the point is not that. It's not pushing against something bad. It's running towards something beautiful, that like the music that they're making is extraordinary. And it's been our loss not to see it because we've been looking at a narrow lens. So for me, it's been about that. And then I will also say that it had a 35-year history of creativity-based education work in public schools. So again, coming back to that fundamental of not necessarily teaching people to play the violin, although it's an incredible pursuit and accomplishes very different goals. It's more about helping students, regardless of their level of musical background, to be able to take a creative impulse or idea and transition it into sound and use that creative practice as a gateway towards the kind of creative thinking that will translate no matter where they want to go in their lives professionally.
So would you say, Melissa, that this is an accelerator? Is this something that, or what term would you say that this program is?
I mean, I do think accelerator is a great word. I think that for me, what has been most special about ACO and the last 4 years of trajectory built upon, multiple decades of past success is that we've been building a really systematic structure for composers to get to know orchestras and to enter the field. There are a number of things that we've done, whether it's expand the number of orchestras who are in the network, build a recruitment network that means that we have, 400 to 500 composers applying for every opportunity we do. We read works, we record them and make them available to the public. There's honestly nothing more important that you can do for a composer than make sure that their work is actually able to be heard. And a little known fact about orchestras is that it's actually quite expensive and difficult for recordings to be made public. So a lot of composers, even far in their career, don't have access to recordings of the works that they have been commissioned to write for orchestras if that structurally wasn't built into the agreement. We've built relationships with international publishers. Boozy and Hawkes is our partner, and that allows us to advocate for these works over a longer period of time. We've built relationships with management companies, which paired with publishing, in the last year alone, the 3 composers who we work with who are represented under that dual model, there have been about 25 opportunities with orchestras that have been generated in that 1 year alone. We build coalitions with the League of American Orchestras. So we have a 30-plus orchestra consortium that commissions new work every year. And ultimately, we're also in a space to be helping composers who are not necessarily seeing themselves as orchestral composers yet, but are successful in other areas of music composition or of creative practice and sound making, to take audacious ideas that are too big, bold, and beautiful for a usual commissioning process and develop them over the course of a year. So really, that's a program called Collaboratory, which I'm super excited about because it's where the very definition of what we think of as American orchestral music gets expanded.
So earlier you talked about how you are using music as a tactic to accelerate progress, right? And we talked about the idea of creativity being able to see something that doesn't exist and music being a tactic to help folks align and move towards that vision, right? I'm curious if you can speak a little bit about the potential of orchestral music, which again, this is going to be one of those things we talk about sandals and crystals. Some folks listening might go, wait, what? But the potential of orchestral music to be a tool to help folks assemble, rally, and move towards a specific vision. When we talk about the world we're living in today, right? We need progress more than ever. Is ACO, or could ACO and your approach to accelerating new and novel composition help us understand what that future vision could look like and help us get there?
Yeah. So there's so many ways to answer your question, but
no.
No is how you end the scene. Remember that from Improv Rules.
Yeah.
I think that the first thing that I would say, just to respond to the heart of what I think you just said, we're in a moment right now where freedom of expression is being suppressed to the point where it's a marker in whether or not the United States is going to be viewed as a democracy moving forward. This is not a drill. It's not a nice to have. It's not a hypothetical. We are in that moment right now. And it's not an accident that whenever anyone in the world throughout history ends up in a situation where there's needing to be a singular authority, the first thing that goes under attack is freedom of thought, creative expression, because that is the framework through which any person engages their power. So for us to recognize that that is important, worth preserving, worth nurturing, worth awakening, that is a critical thing for any artist in any field, orchestral or not, to be considering what their role might be in that process. When I think about an orchestra and why it's important, if you're a spiritual person, you might meditate or pray alone. But what happens when you go to church or temple or synagogue or to your meditation group and you do that together with other people? There's a force multiplier in that. And I think of orchestras in a similar way. They are a space for gathering. They're a space for being able to make music and be creative at scale. And in many situations, they're also institutions that, because of their legacy and because of their position with the public, have been able to sort of amass philanthropic support in a way that can be passed to artists, that create a sustainable path for the life of that artist to be able to create and to be able to be the leader and the Sherpa and the inviter for many other people to express themselves creatively. So when I think about the institutions, there's a lot of conversation right now about the balance of supporting institutions and supporting artists. In the end, a great institution should be about supporting the artist, protecting the artist, creating a beacon and a safe haven, because if we don't protect them, who's going to help us? You know what I mean? So I think that that's just important to recognize. As I think about what these next few years, so I've been at ACO 4 years now, as I think about where I'm headed, I feel like I'm finally getting to the good stuff and the fun stuff, which is to say a lot of the structure has been built and I'm able now to bring a lot of that social and civic practice work and methodology into ACO as a practice. So we're expanding beyond schools to include community partners, public partners, including the Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition of New York, and doing programs at Sing Sing, being able to be in a space where we're, again, positioning the composer and their creativity as a means of invitation, and also supporting as many composers as possible to create their own language for public participation in the way that Pauline did. And I will also say that because we have a network of orchestras around the country that participate with us in a variety of ways, we're also building a network of orchestras that are interested in doing the same thing in their own communities. So we're assembling cohorts of orchestra, composer, and public partner pairs to kind of develop projects that respond to a community-defined vision. We're in a moment right now where there is no art sector, higher education, legal profession separation. Everything that is happening to any one of those groups is happening to us all. So solutions happen through coalitions, and that's what we're looking to build.
Can we come back to, I think, a really, really critical soundbite, not to minimize it as a soundbite, but of the many amazing things you said, I think one of the most important is creativity is actively under attack because that is the framework through which we identify progress and move towards a better future. Right? I'm paraphrasing. But, we talk about this a lot, with ALBC. Part of the reason for this podcast is all 4 of our focus areas are under attack. As you just said, right? It could be legal, it could be art. For us, a more advanced future for healthcare and wellness for folks. Environmental sustainability, don't even need to expand on that one. Social progress and advocacy, and of course, artistic activism. And these have all become intertwined. But one of the most critical takeaways, at least from this conversation for me, is that the reason why what we do now is more important than ever is because creative folks are the way that we envision that future and figure out a pathway towards it, I should say. So for us, the podcast, the entire intention of this, and we are so grateful for you to come on and be part of this conversation, is to empower all of those folks who are creatives, right? Callan, think of your entire community, your entire network of people with tremendous power who have been taught that maybe they're not that important or they don't really have the capability to make change. And that couldn't be further from the truth, right? So I just want to make sure that we take a moment to acknowledge and recognize for all the creative folks listening, this is why we're having this conversation public for you, right? Take up arms in the form of creativity and figure out what the future should look like in your community, in your business, in your world, and let's work together to make it happen. We love Melissa because she's using she's using the orchestra to do that, right? Which again, you think about folks who go, wait, hold on, orchestra and social progress? What? I don't understand. But all of these things are interrelated, right?
I just thought it was the perfect opportunity to bring up that question to Melissa Melissa, what do you feel the role of the artist is? Simon, you expanded the space for us to think about what can we do, how we can do it. Melissa, what do you feel about that?
I think the role of the artist is to help everyone remember that they are an artist. When you're saying, Simon, this is my call out to creatives, I say every one of you listening is a creative. You may just not be awake to that fact yet. There's a reason why when you do mindfulness work for the first time, one of the first things that you'll do is to learn to make your breath something that is intentional. You pay attention to it. You might be manipulating in certain ways, or you might just be observing it as it is. Both of those are valuable. But what you're doing is you're bringing attention to something you're doing all the time, but not thinking about. And that is 100% the same thing when it comes to creative practice, that we don't understand or recognize that the things that we do, whether it's thoughts we put out there, the things we say, how we feel, how we perceive, these are all creative acts. And they're not just shaping your perception of the world. They're actually creating the world around you as a result of your being there and engaging in certain ways. And I think the big original sin of classical music, in air quotes, which I'm using a lot, is teaching people that some people are musicians and some people are not. That has never been true in any indigenous human society. It has always been true that we use music to heal the body, to touch the spirit, to build community, to pass language and story. That has always been true. So it's our job as artists to remember our sort of ancient purpose, you know what I mean? Which is to say, we all are, and it's our job to help people remember that they all are.
Wow. That's just such a gem. I mean, I think that it's a really nice practice. And for you as an artist to remind us, that's something that I move with every day. So I thank you for sharing that with us.
Well, thank you.
I know you have to sign off in just a couple moments, but yeah, just want to say thank you again for taking the time to have this conversation. Hopefully this is the first of many conversations and can help amplify all the other conversations that are happening as these networks start to reform and reconnect and we learn how to, be humans with one another. But thank you again for being open and honest with us and for the incredible sound bites that you've given us.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I think for me, it's just a pleasure to be in such a creative room of people. And, ALBC will always be amongst the absolute most favorite organizations I've ever worked with. I mean, to be able to see at the heart of what is important to communicate and to say and to be creative and understand the value of creativity. I mean, I just love that you're doing this first and foremost. So thank you.
Thank you. So Callan, we only have one other episode left, right?
Wow. Already.
In this season.
I'm already thinking about next season. I know I'm a little ahead of myself, but I love this season so much and I've learned everything. And I feel like next season is going to find me when I'm ready to learn more for my next evolution.
Well, and I know we talked about this before, the concept of a documentary versus a scripted movie. Like for me, going into this without any, solid script of here's exactly what's going to happen and what we're going to learn and what the experience will be. I honestly was not sure what to expect in terms of this episode we just did, but I couldn't be happier with the connection that Melissa helped us make to, in fact, validate. Creativity is an unbelievably powerful accelerant for progress, and creative people, which is all of us, hold the key to making that future that we so desperately need.
Yeah, and just to add back and to reiterate on what Melissa said, it is the coming to it and showing up. We're a part of the experiment just as much as the experiment is a part of us. So I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our next and final episode of this, just to wrap it up and say that I truly believe that we solve that creativity is an accelerant to progress. And I know that that's what we set out to do, is to have this podcast be that validation. And with all the sound clips and gems that we have, I think that we'll be able to keep proving this throughout time.
We would love to hear from you if you've made it this far into the conversation. Do you want a season 2? Do you want us to dig further? Do you want us to elaborate on any specific topics? We would love to hear, because we're having such a blast having these conversations. We'd be happy to do more, but we need to hear about what the most interesting or pressing topics might be.
Mm-hmm. I'd also love questions too. Any questions that you have that like Simon and I could even answer in a moment, we can answer some questions. We'd love to hear it.
All right. Well, I guess tune in to our final episode of season 1, where we will put a bow on all of this and figure out how we move forward from here together.
Yes. And next episode is with one of my favorite guests. All of these guests have been my favorite guests, by the way. But Anya is the founder and chief editor of Broccoli Magazine and Broccoli Publishing, which I believe she's going to wrap this up really nice for us. And I had the pleasure of working with her for years on her team. So I'm really excited to wrap this up in the best way.